Picture this. It's sometime in the early 1800s, and you're standing on the Great Plains. You can see for what feels like forever in every direction. The grass moves like ocean waves, and somewhere out there, maybe 5 miles away, maybe 10, a herd of buffalo darkens the horizon. And you hear them before you see them clearly. That low rumble that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. Tens of thousands of animals moving as one living thing across land that has no fences, no roads, no permanent structures beyond the occasional stone markers left by peoples who came before. This is the world of the Lakota, the Dakota, and the Nakota nations. And here's the thing that gets me about this period. We're not talking about some distant ancient history. We're talking about a time when your great-great-grandparents might have been alive. A complete civilization, a fully functioning empire, really, that controlled territory roughly the size of Texas and California combined. And they did it on horseback. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now the Lakota world turned with the seasons like clockwork. Summer meant the sun dance in the Black Hills, those sacred mountains they called Pahasapa. Think about what that means for a moment. Thousands of people converging on one location for religious ceremonies, political councils, social gatherings. This wasn't random wandering. This was organized, intentional, and it happened every single year. Old women would tell stories around fires about white buffalo calf woman bringing the sacred pipe. Young men would prove themselves in elaborate coming-of-age ceremonies, and everyone knew their role, their place, their responsibility to the whole. Winter was different. Winter meant splitting into smaller bands and finding sheltered river valleys where cottonwood trees could feed the horses and game was plentiful enough to last until spring. Grandmothers taught children the old stories while warriors repaired weapons and planned next year's campaigns. Because yes, there were campaigns. The Lakota didn't control an empire the size of Texas by accident. Let me tell you about two boys growing up in this world. One was called Red Cloud. The other had the deeply unfortunate childhood nickname of Slow. Red Cloud learned warfare the traditional way, by counting coup against Crow enemies. For those unfamiliar, counting coup wasn't about killing. It was about touching an enemy warrior with your hand, or with a special stick, and getting away alive. Can you imagine the nerve that takes? You're charging at an enemy warrior, not to shoot him from a distance, but to slap him and ride away. The closer you get, the more dangerous it is, the more honor you gain. Red Cloud got very, very good at this game. The boy called Slow got his adult name, Sitting Bull, after his first buffalo kill. And here's what's important to understand about that. Buffalo hunting wasn't just about food. It was warfare training. You're riding a horse at full gallop, no saddle, controlling the animal with your knees while you shoot arrows or thrust lances into a 2,000-pound animal that can gore your horse and trample you into paste. The skills you learn doing that, those translate directly to mounted combat. The horse had transformed everything. The Lakota had adopted horses maybe 150 years earlier, probably from Spanish stock that made its way north through trade and raids. And once they had horses, they went from struggling to survive on the plains to absolutely dominating them. Their wealth got measured in ponies and buffalo robes. A man with 100 horses was rich. A man with 300 horses was powerful. And the thing is, you could always get more horses by raiding your neighbors. The Crow, the Pawnee, the Shoshone. These weren't just enemies. They were sources of wealth and proving grounds for young warriors. A successful raid might bring back 50 horses, 100 horses. And those horses meant power. They meant you could outfit more warriors, carry more supplies, move faster across the plains. The entire economy ran on horses and buffalo. Kill buffalo, tan the hides, trade them for guns and metal tools and cloth. Raid enemies for horses. Use horses to hunt more buffalo. It was a cycle that made the Lakota and their relatives incredibly wealthy by the standards of the time. Now here's something that often gets missed in the popular imagination. The Lakota weren't some unchanging ancient culture that had been on the plains forever. They'd moved west from the Minnesota woodlands, maybe 200 years earlier, pushed by pressure from the Ojibwe, who had guns from French traders. The Lakota adapted. They learned to live without the wild rice and fish of the lakes. They mastered the horse. They developed new tactics for new terrain. They weren't stuck in some unchanging traditional ways. They were innovators. When European trade goods started flowing onto the plains through multiple routes, Spanish from the south, French from the north, British from the east, the Lakota integrated them into their way of life. Metal knives were better than stone. Wool blankets were warmer than buffalo robes in some situations. And guns changed everything. A warrior with a rifle had reach and power that arrows couldn't match. Though to be honest, for mounted combat at close range, a good bow was often superior. Faster rate of fire, no reload time, no chance of your powder getting wet. So when the first wagon trains started appearing in the 1840s, warriors watched with something between amusement and confusion. White families traveling in wooden boxes, moving at maybe 2 miles per hour on a good day, vulnerable as newborn rabbits. The Oregon Trail must have seemed like the strangest thing. Why would anyone leave their homeland? Where were they going? And why did they insist on traveling in the most inefficient way possible? The first waves weren't threatening. Curiosity seekers, traders, some missionaries trying to save souls. The Lakota could handle that. Some bands traded with the wagon trains. Fresh vegetables, buffalo meat for tired emigrants. The whites had tools and cloth. The Lakota had food and knowledge of the trail ahead. Commerce happened, but then the numbers started increasing. By 1850, thousands of wagons were rolling through every year. They weren't stopping. They were passing through to Oregon, to California gold fields. Still, they were on the move. Birds passing through on migration. Chiefs like Conquering Bear tried the diplomatic approach. In 1851, he signed papers at Fort Laramie. The deal was simple. The wagon trains could pass through. They were like seasonal migrations of birds. They'd come, they'd go, they wouldn't stay. The Lakota would leave them alone, and in return, they'd get some trade goods and annuities from the government. Seemed reasonable enough. The government promised $50,000 in goods every year for 50 years. That supplies tools, food. In exchange, the tribes agreed to let the emigrants pass unmolested and to pay for any damages caused by their young men. The government could build roads and forts along the trail. And crucially, the treaty recognized tribal territories. This land belonged to the Lakota. The whites acknowledged it. On paper, anyway. For a few years, it more or less worked. Then came August 19th, 1854. A Mormon's cow wandered away from a wagon train and ended up in a Lakota camp near Fort Laramie. A young mini-Konju warrior, probably hungry, probably seeing an opportunity for fresh meat, killed the cow and butchered it. The Mormon wanted compensation. $25, apparently. Now think about how this could have gone. Conquering Bear offered to pay for the cow from the band's annuities. He's trying to smooth things over, trying to keep the peace. $25 was nothing compared to the $50,000 per year the government had promised. Easy solution, right? But Lieutenant John Grattan had other ideas. Grattan was fresh from West Point, young, ambitious, and by several accounts drunk. He'd reportedly bragged he could defeat the entire Lakota nation with a handful of men. He took 29 soldiers and 2 howitzers to arrest the warrior who killed the cow. Think about that response. 29 armed soldiers and artillery pieces over a cow worth $25. The warrior who killed the cow, a man named High Forehead, was a guest in Conquering Bear's camp. By Lakota customs, Conquering Bear couldn't just hand him over. That would be a profound violation of hospitality. So Conquering Bear tried to negotiate. He offered horses, valuable horses worth far more than the cow. He explained that High Forehead was mini-Konju, not Brule like Conquering Bear's band. The political complications were real. Grattan wouldn't budge. He wanted High Forehead in chains. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Warriors started gathering. Women and children moved away from the confrontation point. Grattan deployed his howitzers, and then somebody fired. We're still not sure who shot first. But once the shooting started, it ended fast. Grattan fired the howitzers into Conquering Bear's lodge. The chief stumbled out, wounded. Warriors poured arrows and bullets into the soldiers. Within minutes, Grattan and every one of his soldiers were dead. Conquering Bear died from his wounds soon after. The peaceful chief who tried diplomacy, dead over a cow worth $25, and just like that, the wars began. The army's response was predictable. General William Harney led a punitive expedition in 1855. At Ash Hollow, his troops attacked a Lakota village, killing 86 people, most of them women and children. Harney didn't care about distinguishing between friendly bands and hostile ones. Lakota were Lakota. He took 70 prisoners and marched them around the plains as a show of force. But here's what Harney didn't understand. Violence breeds violence. Every woman killed, every child shot, created new warriors sworn to revenge. Young men, who might have been content trading with the whites, now dedicated their lives to driving them out. And these young warriors quickly figured something out. Attacking supply wagons brought glory and goods. Coffee, sugar, rifles, ammunition, cloth, tools. All the things you couldn't get through traditional means. And these wagon trains? They were easy targets. Slow-moving, poorly defended, packed with stuff worth taking. A successful raid could outfit an entire war party with modern weapons and supplies. Raiding became both a military tactic and an economic opportunity. Why trade buffalo robes for a few blankets when you could take a whole wagon load? Why count coup with a stick when you could kill your enemies and take their rifles? The old ways of warfare started shifting. This wasn't about honor anymore. This was about survival and wealth. By the early 1860s, the Civil War pulled most regular army units east. The frontier forts were manned by volunteers, poorly trained, often poorly led. The wagon trains kept coming, but now they were even more vulnerable. Warriors learned the weak points in the white man's defenses. They learned to attack supply trains, not the forts themselves. Cut the supply lines, and the forts became prisons. The Bozeman Trail opened in 1863, cutting straight through the heart of prime Lakota hunting grounds to reach goldfields in Montana. This wasn't emigrants passing through to Oregon anymore. This was white men coming to stay, to dig gold, to build towns in territory that the Treaty of 1851 had recognized as belonging to the tribes. Red Cloud made a decision. He was going to close that trail, not by fighting one big battle, by making every supply train a rolling death trap, by attacking consistently, relentlessly, until the army couldn't sustain its forts. And it worked. Think about the psychological warfare involved here. You're a civilian teamster contracted to drive a wagon of supplies to some isolated fort. You know that somewhere between here and there, warriors might hit you. You don't know where. You don't know when. You just know that people keep disappearing. Wagons keep getting burned. Bodies keep getting found with arrows in them. How much are they paying you? Is it enough? Red Cloud understood something fundamental about asymmetric warfare. You don't have to win every fight. You just have to make it too expensive for them to stay. Make every mile cost them blood and gold. Make every fort an isolated island that costs more to maintain than it's worth. The army tried to protect the trail with a series of forts. Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith. But protecting them required constant supply trains. And protecting those supply trains required escorts, and those escorts needed supplies. The whole thing became a logistical nightmare. Warriors would hit the hay-cutting parties that needed to feed the fort's horses. They'd attack the wood-cutting details that needed to keep the stoves burning through winter. They'd strike at dawn, at dusk, whenever the soldiers let their guard down. The forts became prisons, where soldiers huddled behind wooden walls, watching the hills for smoke signals, knowing the warriors were out there waiting. By 1865, Red Cloud commanded an alliance that included not just Lakota bands, but Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors. Thousands of fighting men who could coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles. This wasn't random violence. This was organized military resistance with clear strategic objectives. Sitting Bull, now a mature warrior and spiritual leader, led raids in the northern territories. Crazy Horse, still young but already legendary for his courage, led decoy parties that lured soldiers into ambushes. These weren't savages fighting with primitive weapons. These were skilled cavalry commanders with modern rifles, fighting on terrain they knew intimately, using tactics they'd refined over generations, and they were winning. The Bozeman Trail was effectively closed. Supply trains only moved with heavy military escorts, and even then, they took casualties. The forts were barely hanging on. Red Cloud's strategy of making the occupation unsustainable was working. This was the world before the Iron Serpent. A world where the Lakota and their allies had real military power. Where they could dictate terms. Where they could close trails and force the army to negotiate. Red Cloud didn't know it yet, but he was living through the Golden Age, the peak of Plains Indian military power, their wealth measured in horses and robes, their summers filled with ceremony and councils, their winters with stories and preparation for spring campaigns. They controlled an empire of grass and buffalo, and they'd proven they could defend it against the most powerful military force on the continent. But everything was about to change. Because while Red Cloud was bleeding the Bozeman Trail dry, while Sitting Bull was raiding in the north, while Crazy Horse was learning the arts of war, something was happening in the east that would make all their victories meaningless. Something was coming that couldn't be ambushed or outmaneuvered or starved out. Something that would transform the entire equation of power on the plains. The railroad was coming. And when it arrived, it would bring soldiers faster than horses could ride. It would bring hunters who could kill buffalo by the thousands. It would bring settlers by the millions. The warriors who were winning every battle were about to lose the war in a way they couldn't imagine. But that's a story for tomorrow. There's a moment in July 1865 that perfectly captures what the Lakota could do when they put their minds to it. Plattbridge Station in present-day Wyoming. The Army has a small garrison there, protecting one of the few bridges across the North Platte River. It's a strategic choke point, and both sides know it. Now the Cheyenne and Lakota commanders planning this attack understood something that modern military officers would recognize instantly. If you want to destroy an enemy force, you don't just charge at their fortified position. You make them come to you. You make them leave their defenses and walk into your kill zone. Lieutenant Casper Collins was 24 years old. He'd survived the Civil War only to get stationed on the frontier where the real dying was happening. On the morning of July 26th, he received orders to escort a supply train coming up from the south. Standard mission, 5 wagons carrying supplies for the isolated posts. Collins took 25 men and rode out. What Collins didn't know was that somewhere between 800 and 3,000 warriors were waiting for him. The numbers vary depending on who you ask, but let's be conservative and say at least 1,000. 1,000 mounted warriors positioned in draws and coulees where you couldn't see them until it was too late. The decoy party appeared first. Maybe 20 or 30 warriors riding parallel to Collins's column, just out of rifle range. Not attacking, just there, visible, tempting, and here's where tactical discipline matters. Collins could have turned around. He could have gone back to the bridge station and waited. But he had orders to protect that supply train, and those warriors looked like a manageable threat. The instant Collins committed to chasing the decoy party, the trap snapped shut. Warriors poured out of every hiding place. Collins tried to fight his way back to the bridge. He almost made it. But arrows and bullets were coming from every direction. His horse went down. He went down. Within minutes, Collins and most of his men were dead. The supply train saw what happened and tried to circle the wagons. Classic defensive maneuver. But a wagon circle only works if you have enough men and enough ammunition. The warriors kept up steady fire all day. No massive charge that would waste warriors' lives. Just patient, methodical pressure. By late afternoon, the defenders were out of ammunition. The warriors moved in and finished it. 29 soldiers dead. Captured were repeating rifles, cavalry horses, crates of ammunition, and all those supplies meant for frontier forts. And perhaps more importantly, a psychological victory. The army learned that their standard tactics didn't work against these enemies. Now think about what this attack required. Coordination between Cheyenne and Lakota bands. Scouts tracking the supply train and the garrison's patrol schedule. Warriors positioned hours in advance. Discipline to hold fire until the trap was set. This wasn't luck. This was military sophistication. Red Cloud wasn't at Platte Bridge Station, but the attack bore all the hallmarks of his strategic thinking. Don't fight the forts directly. Target their supply lines. Make every mission outside the walls a potential death sentence. Bleed them slowly until the cost becomes unbearable, and it was working. By late 1865, the Bozeman Trail was a death trap. The Army was losing men and material at an unsustainable rate. Fort Phil Kearny, the largest of the posts along the trail, was under constant pressure. Wood-cutting parties needed heavy escorts. Hay-cutting parties needed heavy escorts. Even riding from one building to another inside, the fort felt dangerous because warriors would sometimes get close enough to shoot arrows over the walls. The commander at Fort Phil Kearny was Colonel Henry Carrington. By all accounts, he was a careful, cautious officer who understood how dangerous the situation was. He kept his men close to the fort. He built strong defenses. He avoided unnecessary risks, and his officers hated him for it. Captain William Judd Fetterman was one of those officers. Fetterman had fought in the Civil War. He'd seen real combat against Confederate soldiers. And he looked at these Indian warriors and saw primitive enemies who couldn't possibly stand against disciplined troops in a real fight. Fetterman reportedly boasted that he could ride through the entire Sioux nation with 80 men. December 21st, 1866. Middle of winter. The fort needed wood for heating and cooking, so a wood-cutting party went out under heavy escort. Right on schedule, warriors attacked the woodcutters. This happened almost every day. The pattern was predictable. Attack the work party, draw out a relief force, ambush the relief force if possible. Carrington ordered Fetterman to relieve the woodcutters. His orders were explicit. Drive off the attackers and return to the fort. Do not pursue. Do not cross Lodge Trail Ridge. The ridge was about 2 miles from the fort, and beyond it you couldn't see what was waiting. Fetterman took exactly 80 men. Cavalry and infantry. He reached the woodcutters, drove off the attacking warriors, and then saw a small party of warriors on the ridge. Maybe 10 men. One of them was a young warrior named Crazy Horse, though nobody in Fetterman's command knew his name yet. Crazy Horse and his decoys did exactly what the warriors at Platte Bridge Station had done. They appeared vulnerable. They taunted the soldiers. They rode just close enough to be tempting targets. And then they retreated, not running away in panic, just staying barely out of reach. Fetterman crossed Lodge Trail Ridge. He probably thought he was chasing a small war party. What he was actually doing was walking into the most carefully prepared ambush in the history of the Indian Wars. Behind the ridges, hidden in ravines and draws, somewhere around 2,000 warriors were waiting. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho. The warriors had debated strategy before the battle. Some wanted to use rifles, but ammunition was precious. Most decided to rely on bows and war clubs for the initial assault. Save the bullets for any reinforcements that might come from the fort. Once Fetterman's entire command was past the ridge and into the valley, the warriors attacked from all sides simultaneously. Fetterman tried to form a defensive perimeter. Doesn't matter. The warriors didn't charge straight into the guns. They used the terrain. They fired from cover. They pressed from multiple directions. The fight lasted maybe 40 minutes. Within that time, Fetterman and all 80 men were dead. Many were killed by war clubs, not bullets. The warriors stripped the bodies, took every weapon, every round of ammunition, every piece of equipment that might be useful. They mutilated many of the corpses, though accounts differ on the extent and meaning of the mutilations. When the relief party from the fort finally arrived, they found a scene of absolute devastation. 81 soldiers dead in the snow, the bodies frozen in whatever positions they'd died, and absolute silence. The warriors were gone, taking their victory and their captured equipment with them. Now here's where it gets interesting. Back at the fort, Carrington sent for reinforcements. The messenger, a civilian named John Phillips, rode through a blizzard to Fort Laramie, covering 236 miles in 4 days. His ride probably saved the fort from being overrun that winter, though the warriors never actually attacked the fort directly. But while Phillips was riding south, the warriors were celebrating the greatest victory in their history. Victory feasts lasted for days. Women sang songs honoring the warriors who'd counted coup and taken enemy weapons. Children played with captured cavalry bugles and uniforms. Medicine men declared that the spirits had given them victory. And here's the crucial thing. From the Lakota perspective, they'd proven something fundamental. They could defeat the white soldiers in battle, not through luck or surprise, but through superior tactics and courage. Crazy Horse's decoy party had worked perfectly. The warriors' discipline in holding their positions had been flawless. The battle plan had been executed without a single flaw. Jim Bridger, the legendary mountain man who knew the Lakota as well as any white man could, said it plainly. The Indians had the best light cavalry in the world, period. Could they defeat organized, disciplined infantry in open battle? That was still an open question. But mounted warriors against mounted cavalry in terrain, the warriors chose. Not even close. The army's response to the Fetterman disaster was fascinating. Some officers argued for massive retaliation. Send in thousands of troops and burn every Lakota village they could find. Others argued for negotiation. The Indians had proven they couldn't be easily defeated, so make peace on terms they could accept. But both sides missed the bigger picture. The tactical battles along the Bozeman Trail were becoming irrelevant. Because while Red Cloud was winning his war, while warriors were perfecting their ambush tactics, while the army was debating strategy, construction crews were hammering west from Omaha. The Union Pacific Railroad was coming. Track was being laid at a rate of miles per day. And when those tracks reached the plains, everything would change. A train could carry more soldiers in a day than could march in a month. A train could bring supplies that would have required hundreds of wagons. A train couldn't be ambushed by cavalry because it didn't stop where you wanted it to stop. Red Cloud's brilliant strategy of bleeding the supply lines worked against wagon trains and cavalry columns. It didn't work against locomotives, but in December 1866, Red Cloud didn't know that yet. He only knew that he'd won the greatest victory in living memory. The soldiers were demoralized. The forts were barely hanging on, and spring would bring more attacks, more victories, more pressure, until the whites finally gave up and went home. The victory songs echoed across frozen plains while army commanders back east finally understood they faced not savage raiders, but sophisticated military strategists. Women prepared victory feasts while children played with captured bugles, and medicine men declared the spirits favored their cause. They were right about the spirits favoring them. They'd won every fight that mattered. They'd closed the Bozeman Trail. They'd proven the whites couldn't just take what they wanted without paying in blood. But wars aren't won by tactics alone. Wars are won by logistics, by industrial capacity, by the ability to sustain losses and keep fighting. And in every one of those categories, the warriors were about to be overwhelmed by forces they couldn't even imagine yet. The golden age of Sioux military power had reached its peak. The victories at Plattbridge Station and over Fetterman's command represented the absolute pinnacle of what the horse-mounted plains warriors could achieve. They'd mastered their environment. They'd adapted European weapons and tactics to their own way of fighting. They'd created a military force that could defeat regular army units in the field, and none of it would matter. Because the rules of warfare were changing. The Industrial Revolution was coming to the plains on iron rails. And when it arrived, courage and tactical brilliance wouldn't be enough. The buffalo herds that fed the people, that provided everything from food to shelter to clothing, were about to disappear. Not because warriors stopped hunting them, because professional hunters with long-range rifles would shoot them by the thousands, leaving the carcasses to rot while they took only the hides. The isolation that protected Lakota territory, the sheer distance that made supplying forts so difficult, was about to vanish. A railroad could bring settlers by the thousands, soldiers by the regiment, supplies in quantities that would have been impossible with wagon trains. But that's tomorrow's horror story. Today, in December 1866, Warriors celebrated their greatest victory. And they had every right to celebrate. They'd fought brilliantly. They'd won decisively. They'd proven themselves as warriors and as military strategists. The tragedy is that they'd already lost. They just didn't know it yet. The ground trembled with a rhythm that had never existed in nature. Not the thunder of buffalo hooves, not the rumble of distant storms. This was something new, something wrong, a steady mechanical pounding that you could feel through the earth itself before you heard it with your ears. General Grenville Dodge commanded an army of 10,000 men, not soldiers, though he had plenty of those as guards, workers, Irish immigrants fresh off the boats in New York, looking for any job that paid. Chinese laborers brought from California, where they'd already proven they could build roads through mountains. Former soldiers from both sides of the Civil War who knew how to work under hostile conditions. And they were building west from Omaha at a pace that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. 3 miles of track per day in good weather. Think about what that means. Every single day, the iron road extended 3 miles further west. Rails had to be laid on wooden ties. Ties had to be placed on graded roadbed. Roadbed had to be carved through hills and filled across valleys. Bridges had to be built across rivers. And all of it had to be precise enough that trains could run at speed without derailing. The Casement brothers, Jack and Dan, turned track-laying into a military operation. Their work trains were rolling fortresses, boxcars fitted with rifle ports, flat cars carrying rails and ties, kitchen cars feeding hundreds of men, sleeping cars, mobile towns that moved west with the railhead, and surrounding it all, armed guards who'd learned to shoot during 4 years of civil war. The construction camp itself was organized chaos. The moment the work train stopped, crews swarmed out like ants. Some men graded the roadbed ahead, others placed ties. Still others carried rails, 2 men per rail because a rail weighed several hundred pounds. The rail gang worked in rhythm, placing rails, spiking them down, moving to the next section. The sound of hammers on spikes created a constant drumbeat that could be heard for miles. And behind the main construction, the support infrastructure followed. Telegraph lines being strung, water towers being built, coaling stations, section houses where maintenance crews would live, sidings where trains could pass each other. The railroad wasn't just a line of track. It was an entire industrial system being imposed on the landscape. Warriors watched from the hills. What they were seeing must have seemed like some kind of collective insanity. Thousands of men working from dawn to dusk, building a road for wagons that didn't need horses. The smoking locomotives that pulled the work trains looked like nothing from the natural world. Medicine men reported visions of iron snakes that breathed smoke and fire. It wasn't metaphor. That's exactly what they looked like. In August 1867, a Cheyenne war leader named Turkey Leg decided to strike at this new threat. His warriors had been raiding along the Platte River Valley, hitting stage stations and small settlements. Then they saw an opportunity. Near Plum Creek in Nebraska, the railroad crossed terrain where warriors could approach under cover. The plan was sophisticated. Warriors pried up a section of rail and tied one end to a rope. When they heard a handcar coming, they pulled the rail aside. The handcar derailed, killing the crew. Then the warriors waited for something bigger. A freight train came through after dark. The engineer never saw the missing rail until it was too late. The locomotive hit the gap at speed and plowed into the dirt. Cars piled up behind it. The boiler ruptured, sending steam and fire into the night sky. Warriors killed the surviving crew members and then did something that must have been both terrifying and exhilarating. They broke open the freight cars. Inside were barrels of whiskey, crates of trade goods, bolts of cloth, food supplies, everything a raiding party could want. The warriors built fires around the burning locomotive. They drank the whiskey. They dressed in looted clothes. And they danced. Warriors in stolen top hats and suit coats, dancing around a burning train while the boiler hissed and metal groaned. It was a moment of perfect symbolic victory. The iron horse brought low by human courage and cleverness. Proof that these machines weren't invincible. Proof that the old ways of warfare could defeat this new technology, except it wasn't proof of anything sustainable. The railroad companies telegraphed news of the attack east. Within days, more construction crews arrived with more materials. The damaged section of track was repaired. The wrecked locomotive was cleared away. New trains started running. Turkey Leg's warriors had destroyed one train. The railroad was running dozens of trains per day. The mathematics didn't work in the warriors' favor, and here's the brutal calculus that the railroad companies understood perfectly. Yes, warriors could attack the construction crews. Yes, they might kill workers and delay construction, but every day of delay just meant higher profits when the railroad finally opened for business. The government was paying by the mile of completed track. The companies had every incentive to build fast, and they could absorb losses that would have broken any traditional military force. More importantly, the railroad could bring in reinforcements faster than warriors could organize attacks. A telegraph message could summon cavalry from a fort hundreds of miles away. They'd be there in days, not weeks. The strategic mobility that had always favored the warriors was disappearing. The summit tunnel through the Sierra Nevada showed what the railroad builders were capable of. Chinese workers drilled by hand through solid granite. They used black powder to blast through rock. In winter, they worked in tunnels carved through snowdrifts 40 feet deep. It took months to advance a few hundred feet, but they kept working. They didn't retreat when the weather got bad. They didn't break camp and return in the spring. They just kept drilling and blasting and hauling away broken rock. Medicine men looked at mountains that their ancestors had considered impassable and watched white workers carve through them. What kind of medicine let someone move a mountain? What ritual gave someone the power to change the land itself? The practical leaders like Spotted Tail understood what this meant. The railroad was doom on steel wheels. It didn't matter how many warriors you had or how brave they were. The whites could bring unlimited reinforcements, unlimited supplies. They could build faster than warriors could destroy. And once the railroad was complete, the isolation that had always protected the plains would be gone forever. Hell on wheels towns sprouted behind the advancing railhead. Julesburg, Nebraska. Cheyenne, Wyoming. These weren't permanent settlements at first. They were temporary boom towns that moved with the construction. Saloons made of canvas and scrap lumber. Gambling halls. Prostitutes working out of tents. Merchants selling everything from whiskey to work boots at inflated prices. Violence was constant. Murders were common. Law was whatever the railroad police said it was. And following the towns came the buffalo hunters. Professional killers who saw the vast herds not as sacred animals or as food sources, but as commercial opportunities. Buffalo hides were valuable in eastern markets. Leather for industrial belts. Robes for winter coats. Bones for fertilizer. The entire animal could be converted to profit. Except you didn't need the entire animal. You just needed the hide. William Cody hadn't earned the nickname Buffalo Bill yet, but he was building the reputation that would make him famous. Hired by the Kansas Pacific Railway to feed construction crews, Cody killed 4,280 buffalo in 18 months. That's not a typo. 4,280. He worked with a .50 caliber Sharps rifle that could kill a buffalo at ranges where the animal couldn't even see him clearly. Warriors attacked Cody's hunting parties. They killed some of his crew members. They tried to drive him off. But Cody had learned to work with cavalry escorts. And more importantly, he had a rifle that could shoot accurately at distances where warriors' arrows fell harmlessly short. A buffalo rifle could kill at 600 yards or more. Try hitting anything with an arrow at that range. The hunting method was industrial in its efficiency. Spot a herd. Approach from downwind. Start shooting from a concealed position. The buffalo, not being particularly bright animals, wouldn't necessarily run if they couldn't see or smell the hunter. They'd mill around confused while their companions dropped. A skilled hunter could kill dozens of animals from a single shooting position. Then skinners would move in with wagons. They'd strip the hides, leaving the carcasses to rot. The meat, the organs, everything but the hide, left for scavengers. Plains that had supported massive herds for thousands of years suddenly littered with decaying corpses. Warriors finding these killing fields must have felt like they were witnessing the end of the world. The buffalo weren't just food. They were the entire foundation of Plains culture, spiritual beings that offered themselves for the people's survival. And now they were being slaughtered wholesale, their bodies left to rot, killed for nothing but their skins. The stench of rotting buffalo became a feature of the plains in summer. Millions of pounds of meat feeding nothing but flies and vultures. And behind the hunters came the bone pickers. Homesteaders and desperate people who couldn't find other work would gather buffalo bones from old kill sites. The bones got shipped east by the railroad to be ground into fertilizer. One station in Kansas shipped 2 million pounds of bones in 1874 alone. Think about that, 2 million pounds. That's not a pile of bones. That's hundreds of thousands of animals reduced to fertilizer. Sitting Bull held council after council as hunting parties reported the same story. The buffalo herds were disappearing, not migrating to new territory, disappearing. Bands that had always found plenty of game came back with empty travois. Children went hungry. Old people who remembered times of plenty now faced starvation. Some chiefs, like Spotted Tail, tried accommodation. They settled near agencies where the government promised to provide beef to replace the buffalo. Government beef. Stringy cattle driven north from Texas, slaughtered and distributed as rations. It wasn't the same. It wasn't just that the meat tasted different. The entire way of life was different. You didn't hunt cattle. You didn't follow cattle herds across the plains. You waited at an agency for white men to decide when and how much food you received. Other leaders like Crazy Horse retreated deeper into shrinking pockets of wilderness. The Powder River country. The Bighorn Mountains, places where white settlement hadn't reached yet, where buffalo herds still existed, though thinner every year, where a man could still live by hunting and raiding. But even Crazy Horse must have known it was temporary. The whites weren't going to leave land alone just because it was hard to reach. If anything, that made it more attractive. The transcontinental railroad lines met at Promontory Summit, Utah on May 10, 1869. Leland Stanford drove a golden spike to ceremonially complete the connection. Reporters and photographers documented the moment. Speeches were given about progress and destiny and the unification of the nation. Telegraph wires sent the news east and west simultaneously. From New York to San Francisco, you could now travel by rail in a week. A journey that had taken months by wagon now took days. Sitting Bull supposedly watched from somewhere in the distance. Whether he was actually at Promontory Summit is debatable, but the quote attributed to him captures the moment perfectly. The white men have made an iron road, and they will make the Indians walk it. The iron road didn't just connect east and west. It connected the industrial capacity of the eastern states with the resources of the west. It connected the political power in Washington with the most remote outposts of settlement. It made distance irrelevant. And in doing so, it ended any hope the Plains tribes had of maintaining their independence through isolation. Think about what the railroad meant in practical military terms. Before the railroad, supplying a cavalry regiment on the plains required massive wagon trains. Forage for the horses alone could require dozens of wagons. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare equipment. Every campaign required months of logistical preparation. And every mile between the supply depot and the operational area multiplied the difficulty. After the railroad, you loaded everything on a train. Troops, horses, supplies, all shipped directly to the nearest railhead. A regiment that would have taken months to deploy could now be in position in days. The strategic advantage had always belonged to the side with superior mobility. The railroad gave that advantage to the army permanently. General Phil Sheridan understood this immediately. Sheridan was the man who'd burned the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War. He'd starved out Confederate forces by destroying their agricultural base. Now he commanded the Division of the Missouri, responsible for all military operations on the plains. And he had unlimited reinforcements available via railroad. Sheridan's strategy was simple and brutal. Attack in winter when villages were vulnerable. Use the railroad to position forces so that fleeing bands would run into other military columns. Destroy food supplies. Kill horses so the people couldn't escape. Make it impossible for non-reservation Indians to survive. It was total war. Not warfare for glory or territorial conquest. Warfare aimed at destroying the enemy's capacity to resist. And the railroad made it possible because the army no longer had to worry about supply lines getting cut or reinforcements arriving too late. Everything they needed came by train. The warriors were still dangerous. They still won tactical victories. They still killed soldiers and raided settlements. But they were fighting a defensive war now. They couldn't strike at the source of white power. They couldn't burn down the factories making rifles. They couldn't disrupt the farms growing food. They couldn't cut telegraph lines faster than repair crews could fix them. All they could do was delay the inevitable while their resource base disappeared. By 1870, the situation was becoming desperate. Buffalo herds that had numbered in the millions were down to hundreds of thousands and falling. Hunting parties had to travel further to find game. Warriors spent more time looking for food than preparing for war. And every year, more whites arrived on the railroad. More settlers, more hunters, more soldiers, more. Endless as the grass itself, as Sitting Bull had predicted, the sacred hoop that encompassed the Lakota way of life was bending under pressure it had never faced before. Not pressure from enemy warriors who fought by rules everyone understood. Pressure from an industrial system that didn't care about bravery or honor or treaty rights. Pressure from people who saw the plains not as home, but as empty space to be filled and exploited. The iron serpent had pierced the heart of the buffalo herds, and in killing the buffalo, it was killing everything that depended on them. A way of life thousands of years old was ending, not in dramatic battles, in railroad stations and boneyards and rotting carcasses stretching to the horizon. The next phase would bring battles that would become legend, victories that would echo through history. But they would be the final convulsions of a dying civilization, not the revival of a living one. The Iron Road had been built, and everyone would walk it, whether they wanted to or not. The railroad transformed warfare into mathematics. Simple, brutal calculations that had nothing to do with courage or tactical brilliance. A single train could deliver 1,000 soldiers in days rather than months. A single telegram could coordinate multiple columns across hundreds of miles. The warriors still had skill and determination. The army now had something more powerful. Logistics. General Philip Sheridan stood maybe 5 feet 5 inches tall, short even by the standards of the time. But he'd earned his reputation burning the Shenandoah Valley, cutting the agricultural heart out of the Confederacy. Now he commanded the division of the Missouri with a simple understanding. You don't defeat an insurgency by chasing warriors around the plains. You destroy their ability to sustain resistance. Winter campaigns became Sheridan's signature strategy. Before the railroad, winter campaigns on the plains were nearly impossible. Supply wagons couldn't move through deep snow. Horses couldn't forage when grass was buried. Soldiers froze in inadequate tents. But with railroads, you could position forces before winter, stockpile supplies, and strike when the enemy was most vulnerable. Villages in winter were static. They had to be. You couldn't move a camp of hundreds of people through snowdrifts with children and elderly and all your possessions. You found a sheltered river valley with water and firewood and cottonwood bark for the horses, and you stayed there until spring. Which meant if someone found your winter camp, you couldn't easily run. George Armstrong Custer understood the opportunity. Custer was 38 years old in 1868, young for a lieutenant colonel leading the 7th Cavalry. He'd been a boy general during the Civil War, achieving that rank at 23. Flamboyant, aggressive, and absolutely fearless in ways that got people killed. He saw winter campaigns as a chance to restore a reputation that had suffered from a court-martial and suspension. On November 27th, 1868, before dawn, in temperatures well below freezing, Custer's cavalry attacked Black Kettle's Cheyenne village on the Washita River in present-day Oklahoma. The regimental band played Gary Owen, Custer's favorite tune, as the attack began. Think about that for a moment. A military band playing Irish drinking songs while cavalry charged a sleeping village in the pre-dawn darkness. Black Kettle was a peace chief. He'd survived the Sand Creek Massacre 4 years earlier, where Colorado militia had slaughtered his people, despite them camping under an American flag and a white flag of truce. He'd signed treaties. He'd moved his band to where the government told him to camp. And now, 4 years later, cavalry was attacking again. The village never had a chance. Warriors fought back desperately, trying to give families time to escape. Black Kettle and his wife died in the first minutes, shot while trying to flee across the river. Women and children were killed alongside warriors. Custer's official report claimed 53 women and children captured, 103 warriors killed. Other accounts suggest the ratio was reversed. More women and children dead than warriors. After the fighting ended, Custer's men shot 800 captured horses. 800. That wasn't about military necessity in the moment. That was about destroying the band's mobility permanently. No horses meant you couldn't hunt buffalo effectively, couldn't travel to find game, couldn't escape if another column came after you. You were pinned in place, dependent on whatever the army decided to give you. Custer lost 1 officer and 20 men in the attack. Major Joel Elliott had charged after fleeing villages with a small detachment and got surrounded and killed. Custer, controversially, didn't search for Elliott's missing men before withdrawing. He claimed tactical necessity. Critics said he abandoned men to their deaths. Either way, it established a pattern. Custer prioritized offensive action over the safety of his own troops. The attack on the Washita sent a message to every band still resisting. Winter doesn't protect you anymore. Peace chiefs don't get special treatment. Treaties don't guarantee safety. The only security is complete surrender and acceptance of reservation life. Now let's talk about what was happening to the buffalo during this same period. Because the military campaigns were only half the story. The other half was systematic economic warfare against the foundation of Plains culture. J. Wright Moore was one of the early professional buffalo hunters who recognized the commercial opportunity. In 1871, he shipped a load of buffalo hides east to see if there was a market. There was. Tanneries had figured out how to process buffalo leather for industrial belts. The machinery driving the Industrial Revolution needed leather belts, and buffalo hide was perfect. Suddenly, a buffalo hide was worth $1 to $3. A skilled hunter could kill dozens of animals per day. The rifles these hunters used were specialized tools. Sharps rifles, typically .50 caliber, with telescopic sights and set triggers, heavy enough that you couldn't fire them standing without incredible strength. You found a shooting position, set up a shooting rest, and worked methodically through a herd. The animals, being herd animals with limited predator awareness, didn't necessarily panic if they couldn't see or smell the threat. They'd stand there confused while the hunter reloaded and fired, until the herd finally scattered or enough animals were down that it wasn't worth pursuing. Here's what that looked like in practice. A hunter would approach a herd from downwind, staying hidden. Find a suitable shooting position with a clear view. Start with the dominant animals, the leaders. If you killed the leaders first, the rest of the herd would mill around confused instead of running. Then you worked systematically through the animals, taking the easiest shots. 50 animals in an hour wasn't unusual for a skilled hunter with good conditions. The skinners followed with wagons. Professional skinners could remove a hide in maybe 5 minutes. They'd make a few strategic cuts, hook the hide to a horse or mule, and literally peel it off the carcass. The hide went in the wagon. Everything else stayed where it fell. Ton after ton of meat left to rot. The economics didn't support harvesting the meat. Hides were valuable and relatively light. Meat was heavy, spoiled quickly, and the market was already oversupplied with cheap beef. By 1873, there were thousands of professional hunters working the plains. Some worked alone or in small groups. Others organized into larger operations with multiple hunting and skinning crews. The efficiency was industrial. Hunting camps became processing facilities. Hides got staked out to dry, then bundled and shipped via railroad to eastern tanneries. One station in Dodge City, Kansas, shipped over 200,000 hides in a single year. That's one railroad station 1 year. Multiply that across all the shipping points along the Kansas Pacific and Union Pacific and other rail lines, and you're looking at millions of animals killed annually. Warriors tried to fight back. They attacked hunting camps, killed hunters, burned wagons full of hides. But they couldn't be everywhere. The plains were too vast, the hunters too numerous, and every warrior spending time fighting hunters was a warrior not hunting for his own band. The security situation was forcing them to choose between feeding their families and trying to protect the herds. Some hunters died. Most didn't. The army provided escorts when possible. Hunters worked in armed groups and learned to fort up when attacked. And economically, the loss of a few hunters didn't matter. The profit margins were high enough that companies could absorb casualties and keep operating. Sitting Bull watched the buffalo disappear and understood what it meant. The whites weren't just taking the land. They were destroying the ability to live on the land. Even if you drove out every soldier, every settler, every miner, what would you eat? The buffalo that had sustained the people for generations were being exterminated as a matter of deliberate policy. Because here's the thing that sometimes gets overlooked. The military leadership understood exactly what killing the buffalo accomplished. Sheridan supposedly said, and I'm paraphrasing here because the exact quote is disputed, that buffalo hunters were doing more to settle the Indian question than the army ever could. Kill the buffalo, and you force the Indians onto reservations. No buffalo means no independence. It's that simple. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't just market forces at work. This was strategic economic warfare. Destroy the enemy's resource base, and you destroy their ability to resist. Sherman and Sheridan had used the same strategy against the Confederacy. Burn the crops, destroy the livestock, make it impossible for the South to feed its armies. Now they were applying those lessons to the plains. Native hunting parties found the evidence everywhere. Valleys that had sheltered herds now filled with rotting carcasses. Streams contaminated by decaying buffalo. The stench of death hanging over the plains in summer. And each year fewer and fewer live buffalo bands held councils trying to decide what to do. Some chiefs like Spotted Tail argued for surrender. Accept reservation life while you still have the strength to negotiate terms. The buffalo were gone or going. Fighting would only get more people killed. At least on a reservation. The government promised food and supplies. Other leaders, like Crazy Horse, refused. Better to die free than live as prisoners. The buffalo might return. The whites might leave. Anything was possible if you kept fighting. Surrender was permanent. Death was just death. Sitting Bull occupied a middle position. He didn't advocate surrender, but he also didn't advocate suicidal resistance. He counseled patience. Watch for opportunities. Preserve the people's strength. The spirits would provide guidance, but even Sitting Bull couldn't deny the mathematics. His band needed food. The buffalo were disappearing. Government agencies offered beef rations in exchange for settling on the reservation. Each day you stayed free was a day your children went hungry. How long could you watch your children starve before you accepted the white man's beef? Some families started drifting toward the agencies, not whole bands at first. A family here, another there. People who couldn't face another winter of hunger. The government called them friendly Indians and gave them rations. The non-reservation bands called them traitors, and worse. But desperation makes its own logic. By 1874, the division between agency Indians and non-reservation bands was becoming a chasm. Agency Indians had reliable food but no freedom. Non-reservation bands had freedom but faced starvation. Neither option was acceptable. Both were becoming necessary. The Army's campaigns continued relentlessly. Winter strikes, summer pursuits. Cavalry streaming from railroad depots to attack camps, destroy food supplies, capture horses. The columns were coordinated by telegraph. If one column pushed a band north, another column was already in position to intercept. If a band raided in one area, cavalry from 3 different forts might converge on their last known position. The warriors were still formidable fighters. They still won tactical victories. But they were losing the strategic war because the strategic war was about resources, not battles. You can't eat victory. You can't shelter your children in glory. And the buffalo that made independence possible were disappearing faster than anyone had thought possible. One particularly grim statistic. In 1870, estimates suggested there were still several million buffalo on the southern plains. By 1874, the southern herd was effectively extinct. 4 years. That's how long it took industrial hunting to eliminate millions of animals that had sustained human populations for thousands of years. The northern herd lasted longer, protected by distance and less developed railroad infrastructure. But the pattern was clear. The hunters were coming north. The rails were extending into Montana territory. And when they arrived, the northern herd would disappear just as quickly as the southern herd had. Crazy Horse retreated deeper into the Powder River country and the Bighorn Mountains. These were some of the most remote, difficult territories on the northern plains. Few whites wanted to settle there. The land was too rough, the growing season too short, the winters too brutal. But for hunters and warriors who knew the country, it offered sanctuary for now. Because even remote sanctuaries have a limited lifespan when railroads can bring unlimited settlers and the government has decided your existence threatens its plans for development. The Treaty of 1868 had recognized the Black Hills and surrounding territories as Lakota land. No whites allowed without permission. But treaties had a way of becoming inconvenient when something valuable was discovered. And in 1874, George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills that discovered something very valuable indeed. Gold, the one thing that could overcome any treaty provision, any military consideration, any moral argument. Gold in the Black Hills meant thousands of miners would come, whether the government permitted it or not. And once the miners came, the government would send troops to protect them. And once troops were protecting miners, the treaty was dead no matter what it said on paper. Sitting Bull and the other chiefs knew what was coming. They'd seen it happen before. First the miners, then the settlers, then the troops, then the reservations. The pattern was predictable as the seasons. And this time there was nowhere left to retreat. The Black Hills were Pahasapa, the sacred center of Lakota cosmology. If you couldn't defend the Black Hills, what could you defend? The government sent a commission to negotiate a purchase. They offered money for the hills. Sitting Bull's response was absolute. He would not sell the land where his ancestors' bones rested. The Black Hills were not for sale at any price. Other chiefs agreed. Some because of spiritual conviction, others because they understood that selling the Black Hills meant accepting the end of any independent existence. The commission left without an agreement, and the miners kept coming. By 1875, thousands of whites were illegally prospecting in the Black Hills. The army made token efforts to remove them, but it was like trying to stop water from flowing downhill. The economic incentive was too strong. The enforcement too weak. In December 1875, the government issued an ultimatum. All Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota bands must report to agencies by January 31st, 1876, or be considered hostile. Any Indians found off the reservation after that date would be subject to military action. The deadline was absurd. January on the northern plains meant temperatures well below zero. Snow drifts higher than a horse's head, travel nearly impossible for people with children and elders. The government knew this. The deadline wasn't designed to be met. It was designed to provide legal justification for what was coming next. Total war. Not limited campaigns with specific objectives. Total war aimed at forcing every last band onto reservations by whatever means necessary. Sheridan would coordinate multiple columns converging on the non-reservation bands. Crook from the south, Terry and Custer from the east, Gibbon from the west. The bands would be trapped between converging forces with nowhere to run. But the non-reservation bands weren't running. They were gathering, coming together in numbers not seen in a generation. If the government wanted war, the warriors would give them war. And this time, with thousands of warriors assembled, they might win a victory so decisive that even the whites would be forced to negotiate seriously. Sitting Bull performed the sun dance in early summer of 1876. He cut 50 pieces of flesh from his arms as an offering to the spirits. He danced until he collapsed from pain and exhaustion. And when he woke, he described a vision. Soldiers falling from the sky like grasshoppers, falling upside down into the Lakota camp. Dead soldiers falling into camp. Victory, the people believed. How could they not? Sitting Bull's visions had proven true before. The spirits were speaking. The soldiers were coming and they would fall. The largest gathering of Plains warriors in history was preparing for the largest battle they would ever fight. And somewhere to the east, George Armstrong Custer was riding toward his appointment with history. The Black Hills were called Pahasapa in Lakota, the sacred center of their world. Mountains rising from the plains like a vision, covered in dark pines that gave them their name. This was where the spirits lived, where vision quests happened, where the people's connection to everything sacred was rooted in the earth itself. When Custer's expedition confirmed gold in those hills in 1874, he didn't just discover a mineral resource. He signed a death warrant for Lakota independence. Because nothing, absolutely nothing, would keep white miners out once gold was confirmed. Not treaties, not military force, not moral arguments, nothing. By 1875, thousands of miners were flooding into the Black Hills. The army made half-hearted attempts to remove them, but it was theater. Everyone knew it. The miners would sneak back in within days. And politically, the government couldn't be seen as protecting Indian rights over white economic opportunity. Not in 1875. Not ever, really. The government sent a commission to negotiate a purchase. They arrived with an offer. $6 million for the Black Hills and surrounding territory. To put that in perspective, that's roughly what the United States paid for Alaska. An entire future state for about the same price they were offering for a relatively small chunk of the northern plains. The commission met with chiefs and headmen in September 1875. Sitting Bull wasn't there. He'd refused to attend. His position was absolute, and he saw no reason to negotiate about it. But other chiefs spoke. Red Cloud, who'd won his war and signed the treaty that supposedly protected this land, listened to the offer. Then Sitting Bull's representative, a warrior whose words carried the spiritual leader's authority, responded. I'm paraphrasing, but the essence was clear. We will not sell the land where our ancestors are buried. The Black Hills are not for sale at any price. These mountains are the heart of everything that is. You're asking us to sell our heart. The commission tried to negotiate. Would the tribes lease the land? Accept annual payments, anything? The answer remained no. Not every chief agreed. Some could read the future clearly enough to know that refusing wouldn't stop the miners. But enough refused that no agreement could be reached. The commission reported back to Washington that negotiations had failed. And that's when the government changed its approach. If the tribes wouldn't sell the Black Hills, the government would simply take them. But you can't openly violate a treaty you signed 7 years earlier without some justification. You need the tribes to be in violation first. December 18th, 75. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs issued an ultimatum. All Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota bands living off the reservation must report to agencies by January 31st, 1876. Any bands not reporting by that date would be considered hostile. Military action would follow. Now think about what that deadline meant in practical terms. It's December. On the northern plains, winter camps are established in sheltered valleys, moving an entire band through snow and sub-zero temperatures, with children, elders, pregnant women, sick people. Moving when game is scarce and the horses are weak from limited forage. Moving hundreds of miles to agencies that might not even have supplies ready to receive you. The deadline was impossible to meet, and everyone involved knew it. Runners were sent to find the scattered bands, but many never reached them. Those that did arrived with a message that seemed designed to provoke rather than persuade. Come in within 6 weeks during the worst weather of the year, or we'll treat you as enemies. Sitting Bull's response, when he heard about the ultimatum, was straightforward. He wasn't coming in. Not in January, not ever. This was his land. The treaty said so. The whites could either honor their word or prove they had no honor. He would not abandon his people's territory because the government decided treaties were inconvenient. Crazy Horse felt the same. He was in his mid-30s now, at the peak of his powers as a warrior and leader. He'd never lived on a reservation, and never would if he could help it. The deadline meant nothing. The threats meant nothing. He would stay free or die trying. The January 31st deadline passed. Most of the non-reservation bands hadn't even received word of the ultimatum in time to respond, let alone comply. Others had received it and ignored it. The government declared them hostile and ordered military action. General Sheridan planned a coordinated campaign. 3 columns would converge on the non-reservation bands. General George Crook would move north from Fort Fetterman in Wyoming. Colonel John Gibbon would move east from western Montana. General Alfred Terry, with Custer's 7th Cavalry, would move west from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. The bands would be caught between converging forces and crushed. Crook moved first. His column included over 1,000 soldiers and hundreds of Crow and Shoshone scouts. These tribal enemies of the Lakota saw an opportunity to strike at old foes with army support. Crook was competent, experienced, and cautious. He didn't expect easy victories. On March 17, 1876, Crook's advance force under Colonel Joseph Reynolds attacked a village on the Powder River. The attack was supposed to be a repeat of the Washita. Strike at dawn, destroy the camp, kill resistance, move on. Instead, it turned into a confused fight where warriors counterattacked and nearly overran the soldiers. Reynolds captured the camp, but then abandoned it, allowing warriors to recapture their lodges and most of their possessions. Crook was furious. He'd suffered casualties and achieved nothing permanent. More importantly, the attack warned the non-reservation bands that the army was coming in force. Time to gather together for mutual protection. Time to prepare for war. Through the spring, bands converged on the Powder River and Tongue River valleys. Hunkpapa Lakota under Sitting Bull, Oglala under Crazy Horse, Minikunju, Senzark, Brule, Northern Cheyenne, some Arapaho. Families from the agencies slipped away to join their relatives. Young men eager for war, women and children seeking the safety of numbers. By late May, the gathering was the largest concentration of Plains Indians anyone had seen in years. Maybe 15,000 people total, perhaps 3,000 warriors. Not all were committed to war. Many were there for the traditional summer gatherings, the social and spiritual ceremonies that happened every year. But when the army came, every able-bodied man would fight. Sitting Bull performed the Sundance in early June. The Sundance was the most important religious ceremony of the year, a renewal of the people's covenant with the sacred powers. Warriors would pierce their chests with skewers attached to the center pole and dance until the skewers tore free. Proof of courage and devotion to the people's welfare, Sitting Bull, as a spiritual leader, participated in a different way. He had a relative cut 50 pieces of flesh from his arms. 50 small pieces, but the cumulative pain was immense. Then he danced. Hour after hour in the sun, blood running down his arms, dancing until he collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss. When he regained consciousness, he described a vision. Soldiers and horses falling from the sky like grasshoppers, falling upside down into the camp. Dead soldiers falling into the village. Victory, but a voice in the vision warned him. You may take their possessions, but do not take their guns. The spoils would bring contamination. The people believed. Sitting Bull's medicine was strong. His visions had proven accurate before. If he saw soldiers falling like grasshoppers, then soldiers would fall. The spirits had spoken. Victory was coming. Crook tried again in June. His column, reinforced and more carefully organized, moved north, looking for the hostile bands. On June 17th, along Rosebud Creek, Crazy Horse led an attack that stopped Crook cold. This wasn't an ambush of a small patrol. This was a pitched battle between over 1,000 warriors and more than 1,000 soldiers. The fighting lasted for hours. Warriors would charge, draw fire, retreat, regroup, and charge again from a different direction. They used terrain expertly, appearing and disappearing, never giving the soldiers a clear target. Crook's Crow and Shoshone scouts fought well, but they were outnumbered by Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. By late afternoon, Crook had taken casualties and accomplished nothing. He withdrew south, claiming victory but clearly shaken. His column camped and waited for reinforcements. For the next crucial 6 weeks, Crook was out of action, effectively removing 1/3 of Sheridan's coordinated campaign from the field. The warriors celebrated the Rosebud fight as a victory. They'd faced a large army force and driven it away. Sitting Bull's vision was proving true. But the real test was coming. Terry's column, with Custer's 7th Cavalry as its strike force, was moving west into Montana territory. On June 21st, Terry held a conference with his officers. They'd found a recent trail indicating a large village ahead. The plan was for Gibbon's infantry to block the Little Bighorn Valley from the north, while Custer's cavalry attacked from the south. They would trap the village between two forces. Custer received his orders on June 22nd. Follow the trail, find the village, attack with the 7th Cavalry while Gibbon's column blocked their escape. Terry expected the village to try to flee. Nobody expected it to stand and fight. The pattern had always been that villages scattered when attacked by large military forces. The 7th Cavalry rode out with about 600 men. Custer declined additional cavalry companies, supposedly saying the 7th could handle anything it encountered. He also declined Gatling guns, saying they'd slow him down. And critically, he declined most of the offered Arikara scouts who knew the terrain and might have provided better intelligence. Custer pushed his men hard. Long marches covering 40 miles in a day. The trail was getting fresher. The village was close. On June 24th, scouts reported an enormous village ahead in the Little Bighorn Valley, the largest concentration of lodges they'd ever seen. Custer didn't believe the reports. He thought the scouts were exaggerating. Here's what Custer was thinking. He knew villages fled when attacked. If he waited for Terry and Gibbon to get in position, the village would scatter and escape. Better to attack immediately and accept that some families would escape than wait and risk the entire village disappearing. This wasn't recklessness from Custer's perspective. This was tactical necessity based on how previous engagements had gone. What Custer didn't know was that this village wasn't going to run. They'd beaten Crook at the Rosebud. They had thousands of warriors. They had Sitting Bull's vision promising victory. They were done running. June 25th, 1876. Custer divided his regiment into 3 battalions. Captain Frederick Benteen, with about 125 men, would scout to the south and prevent escape in that direction. Major Marcus Reno, with about 140 men, would attack from the south end of the village. Custer, with about 210 men, would move north and attack from another angle. The pack train, with supplies and ammunition, would follow under guard. It was standard tactics for dealing with Indian villages. Multiple columns to prevent escape, but it assumed the village would try to escape. Reno attacked first around 3 in the afternoon. His battalion charged toward the south end of the village, but was met by hundreds of warriors streaming out to meet them. Not fleeing, attacking. Within minutes, Reno's charge faltered. His men dismounted and formed a skirmish line in timber along the river. The warriors surrounded them and poured fire into the position. Reno panicked. He ordered a retreat back across the river to high ground. The retreat became a rout. Men ran for their lives while warriors pursued, shooting into the mass of soldiers. Reno lost about 1/3 of his command killed or wounded in the first engagement and retreat. The survivors fortified on a hilltop, pinned down, unable to do anything but defend. Custer, hearing the gunfire, assumed Reno's attack was succeeding. He moved his battalion north along the ridges, looking for a place to strike into the village. What he found instead was thousands of warriors who'd defeated Reno, turning their attention to his force. The details of what happened next are disputed because nobody from Custer's immediate command survived to describe it. But piecing together archaeological evidence, accounts from warriors who fought there, and the positions of bodies found later, we can reconstruct the general sequence. Custer tried to reach the river, but was blocked by warriors. He pulled his men back to high ground. Companies tried to form defensive positions, but were overwhelmed before they could establish secure perimeters. Warriors led by Crazy Horse, Gaul, and Lame White Man attacked from multiple directions. The soldiers were mounted at first, then dismounted, then dying in groups as warrior pressure collapsed one position after another. The entire fight probably lasted 90 minutes, maybe less. 210 soldiers, including Custer, every officer in his battalion dead. The bodies stripped of weapons, clothing, anything useful. Many bodies mutilated. Accounts from warriors describe the fight as a rolling series of engagements where soldiers would make a stand, fire until they ran out of ammunition, then die under a wave of arrows and bullets. Some soldiers tried to run. They died in ravines and gullies where warriors ran them down. Some fought to the very end. They died in clusters around dead horses, using the bodies for cover until no cover was enough. A few might have killed themselves rather than be captured. The archaeological evidence shows a lot of spent cartridges from soldier weapons, suggesting they fought hard, but ultimately it didn't matter. The warriors were exultant. They'd killed Longhair, the soldier chief who'd attacked Black Kettle's village. They'd destroyed an entire battalion of cavalry. Sitting Bull's vision had proven true. Soldiers falling like grasshoppers into camp. Victory songs rang through the night. Women trilled in celebration. Young men counted coup on the bodies of famous enemies, but some of the older leaders looked at the field of dead soldiers and felt dread. Sitting Bull reportedly walked through the carnage and warned the warriors not to take the soldiers' guns because it would bring bad medicine. More practically, he knew what this victory meant. The whites would never forgive this, never forget. The revenge would be terrible. The next day, June 26th, warriors surrounded Reno and Bentine's combined force on their hilltop position. They could have overrun it with enough pressure, but the cost would have been high. And scouts reported more soldiers coming. The column under Terry and Gibbon was approaching. Time to break camp and scatter before being trapped between converging forces. The village dispersed in multiple directions. Families packed up and moved quickly. The great gathering dissolved as bands returned to their traditional territories. The warriors had won the greatest victory in their history, and many of them knew, even in the moment of triumph, that it was also their doom. Terry and Gibbon found Custer's dead 3 days later. The bodies had been in the sun. Scavengers had been at work. The scene was horrific. They buried the remains quickly and inadequately. Later, Custer's body was exhumed and reburied at West Point. News of the defeat reached the east via telegraph and exploded across the nation. The headlines hit during the centennial celebrations of American independence. The 4th of July, 1876. 100 years of American independence, and Indians had just wiped out a cavalry regiment. The public reaction was volcanic. Custer became a martyr instantly. The details of how he divided his force, ignored his scouts, and rushed into battle without proper reconnaissance got overlooked. The narrative became civilized soldiers massacred by savage Indians. Every demand for revenge, every call for total war, every argument for extermination found support in the graves at Little Bighorn. The warriors celebrated while they could. Great feasts, dances that lasted through the night. Stories that would be told for generations. Young men had counted their first coups. Warriors had taken fine weapons and horses. The victory was absolute, but Sitting Bull's warning echoed in the minds of those wise enough to understand. They'd won the battle. They'd lost the war, because the whites would never stop coming now. Never negotiate with honor. Never accept any outcome except complete submission. The reservation offered survival without freedom. Resistance offered freedom without survival. And now, after Little Bighorn, even the possibility of negotiated peace was gone. The government would demand unconditional surrender, and would send enough soldiers to enforce that demand. The bands scattered to their hunting grounds, trying to preserve some semblance of the old life for whatever time remained. The buffalo were nearly gone. The soldiers were everywhere. And winter was coming, the hardest winter the people had ever faced, because now they faced not just cold and hunger, but the systematic pursuit of an enemy that would never stop hunting them. The victory songs would echo through the people's memory for generations. But the songs would be tinged with sorrow, because Little Bighorn was the last great victory. The last moment when the warriors proved themselves superior in battle. The last time the spirits promised victory and delivered. Everything after would be retreat, surrender, starvation, and loss. The grasshoppers had fallen, and in falling, they'd summoned an army of revenge that would not stop until every last band surrendered or died. The retribution came swift as winter wind. General Sheridan didn't just want revenge for Little Bighorn. He wanted the complete and permanent end of Indian resistance on the plains. And now he had political support for whatever measures he deemed necessary. Congress voted funds. The army got reinforcements. The orders were clear. Hunt down every band that hadn't surrendered and force them onto reservations by whatever means required. The strategy was simple and brutal. Winter campaigns. Multiple columns converging from different directions. Give the bands no rest, no time to hunt, no opportunity to establish secure winter camps. Pursue relentlessly until they surrendered from exhaustion and starvation. Colonel Nelson Miles was the perfect instrument for this strategy. Bearcoat, the Lakota called him from his buffalo coat. Miles was 37 years old, ambitious, and understood that successful Indian campaigns could make a military career. He'd married into the Sherman family, giving him powerful connections. And unlike some officers who saw frontier service as punishment, Miles saw it as opportunity. Miles commanded the 5th Infantry at the Tongue River Cantonment in Montana Territory. From there, he launched winter operations that gave the non-reservation bands no peace. His troops marched in sub-zero temperatures. They tracked bands across snow-covered plains. They attacked winter camps, destroyed food supplies, captured horses, and pushed exhausted families from one temporary refuge to another. The bands that had celebrated at Little Bighorn spent the fall and winter of 1876 to 77 running. They couldn't establish proper winter camps because Miles' columns might find them. They couldn't hunt effectively because they had to keep moving. The children were hungry. The old people were dying. The horses were starving because there was no time to find good grazing or gather cottonwood bark for feed. Sitting Bull's band moved north toward Canada. The Medicine Line, they called it. The border between the United States and British territory. Maybe across that line they could find peace. Maybe the British would honor their own agreements with tribes differently than the Americans honored theirs. It was a slim hope, but hope nonetheless. Crazy Horse stayed in the Powder River country, trying to maintain some kind of traditional life. His band moved constantly, always watching for army columns. They raided when they could, taking horses and supplies. But the opportunities for successful raids were diminishing. The army had troops everywhere. Settlements had armed guards. Even small wagon trains traveled with military escorts. In January 1877, Miles caught up with Crazy Horse's band at Wolf Mountain. In a blizzard. Think about that. The army was now campaigning in conditions that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Miles had about 400 soldiers and mounted infantry. Crazy Horse had maybe 500 warriors. The fight lasted most of a day. Warriors charged repeatedly through blowing snow, trying to overrun the soldier positions. Miles' men formed defensive squares and used their artillery, firing explosive shells that terrified the horses and tore through warrior positions. The battle was tactically inconclusive. Both sides withdrew. But strategically, it was another disaster for Crazy Horse. His people were starving. The horses were dying. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The band couldn't run anymore. And Miles would be back with more soldiers, more supplies, more artillery. The mathematics were inexorable. The army could absorb defeats and keep fighting. The bands couldn't. One by one, chiefs surrendered, not because they'd been defeated in battle, because their people were starving and winter was killing the children. Touch the Clouds came in. Big Road came in. Little Big Man came in. Each surrender made the remaining holdouts more isolated and more vulnerable. The agencies weren't paradise. Rations were often late or insufficient. The beef was poor quality. Indian agents were frequently corrupt, selling supplies meant for the tribes and pocketing the proceeds. But at least there was food. At least children weren't dying from exposure in the winter cold. At least you could stop running. Crazy Horse held out longer than most. Through the winter, into spring. His band was down to maybe 900 people, including warriors, women, children, and elders. The horses were eating bark stripped from trees. The people were eating their dogs. There was no game left in their territory because they'd hunted it out and couldn't travel to find more. In May 1877, Crazy Horse came into Fort Robinson in northwestern Nebraska. 900 followers, their ponies eating bark because there was no grass yet. The people gaunt from hunger. The army treated it as a great victory. The most famous hostile chief had surrendered. The Indian Wars in the north were effectively over. But Crazy Horse never adapted to reservation life. He was maybe 35 years old, at the peak of his warrior abilities, now living in idleness under the supervision of people he'd been fighting for years. The other chiefs at the agency were jealous of his fame and suspicious of his intentions. Army officers worried he might lead a breakout. Everyone was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The mistake came in September. The exact details are murky and probably always will be. The army wanted Crazy Horse to scout for them against the Nez Perce, who were fighting their own war in Montana. Crazy Horse allegedly said he'd fight until not a white man was left. Or maybe the translator deliberately mistranslated. Or maybe Crazy Horse said he'd fight until no enemy was left, meaning he'd fight against the Nez Perce. The translation, either honest mistake or deliberate sabotage, turned into an excuse for arrest. On September 5th, 1877, officers tried to arrest Crazy Horse at Fort Robinson. He resisted. The accounts differ on exactly what happened next. But the end result was that a soldier bayoneted Crazy Horse. The wound was fatal. He died that night, not yet 40 years old. Some accounts say Little Big Man, his former friend, held his arms while the soldier struck. Other accounts dispute this. His parents took his body and buried it somewhere in secret. The location remains unknown to this day. The greatest warrior of his generation, the man who'd led the decoy party at the Fetterman fight, who'd charged at the Rosebud, who'd helped destroy Custer's command, died in a scuffle at a reservation fort. Not in battle, not surrounded by enemies he could fight, betrayed by his own people and stabbed by a soldier while detained. The death of Crazy Horse marked the end of any realistic hope for armed resistance in the North. If Crazy Horse could be killed while under detention at a reservation, who was safe? If the greatest warrior could end up dead on a reservation floor, what chance did anyone else have? Sitting Bull stayed in Canada. The Grandmother's Country, they called it, referring to Queen Victoria. The Northwest Mounted Police treated them reasonably well. There was no active warfare. But there also weren't buffalo. The great herds didn't extend significantly across the medicine line. And the Canadian government made it clear that these refugees were temporary guests, not permanent residents. 4 years. Sitting Bull's band endured 4 years of increasing desperation in Canada. Hunger was constant. The children were sick. The old traditions of the sun dance and other ceremonies continued, but how do you maintain a spiritual connection to the land when you're starving? How do you teach children the old ways when there's no game to hunt and no enemies to prove yourself against? The Canadian government pressured them to return to the United States. The American government sent commissions offering amnesty if they surrendered. One by one, families gave up and drifted back across the border. By 1881, Sitting Bull's band was down to fewer than 200 people. Pride and principle couldn't feed children. Spiritual conviction couldn't stop starvation. On July 19, 1881, Sitting Bull crossed back into the United States and surrendered at Fort Buford in Dakota Territory. He was about 50 years old, the most famous Indian in North America, the spiritual leader who'd orchestrated the greatest Indian victory in history, surrendering because his children were hungry. The surrender ceremony was carefully choreographed. Sitting Bull wore simple clothes. He handed his rifle to his young son and had the boy present it to the commanding officer. A symbolic statement. I fought as a warrior. Now I give you my weapons through my son, showing that the future must be different than the past. The army officers probably didn't catch the symbolism, but other Lakota did. Sitting Bull spent the next 2 years as a prisoner of war, essentially. Moved between military posts, kept under surveillance, prevented from returning to his own people. The government feared his influence. Even in defeat, even in surrender, Sitting Bull commanded respect and loyalty from his people. That made him dangerous. In 1883, the Northern Pacific Railway held a ceremony to celebrate the completion of its line. The last spike driven, the transcontinental connection finalized, and in a moment of either supreme irony or deliberate humiliation, they invited Sitting Bull to give a speech. Sitting Bull spoke in Lakota. He talked about his hatred for white people, his disgust at what had been done to his people, his contempt for the broken promises and violated treaties. He spoke from his heart, in his language, saying things the assembled dignitaries would have found shocking if they'd understood. The translator, standing beside him, gave a completely different speech in English, praising progress, celebrating the railroad, thanking the white benefactors for their kindness. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Sitting Bull stood there, his real words hanging in the air in a language the audience didn't understand, while the translator told them what they wanted to hear. It was brilliant subversive resistance. The conquered chief publicly expressing his hatred while the conquerors applauded, thinking he was thanking them. Sitting Bull got his moment of defiance. The railroad got its propaganda. Everyone went home satisfied, except anyone who spoke both Lakota and English, and understood what had actually happened. Later, Buffalo Bill Cody recruited Sitting Bull for his Wild West show, the show that would tour America and Europe, turning the Indian Wars into entertainment. Sitting Bull traveled with the show for a season in 1885, performing for crowds who'd cheered when news of his surrender reached them. The savage chief who'd killed Custer, now reduced to a circus attraction. He made money, $50 a week plus a signing bonus, more cash than most Indians ever saw. He used much of it to buy food for hungry people on the reservation. The white audiences who paid to see the savage chief probably never realized they were indirectly feeding the people whose destruction they demanded. The humiliation was comprehensive. The warrior who'd never been defeated in battle, displaying himself for white entertainment. The spiritual leader who'd foreseen Custer's death, now taking orders from show managers. The chief who'd refused to sell the Black Hills, now selling his image for ticket sales. Everything sacred reduced to spectacle, but Sitting Bull maintained his dignity. He sat on his horse during the shows, wearing traditional dress, accepting the applause and the jeers with equal indifference. He'd fought the fight that could be fought. Now he was surviving the only way left. And if survival meant performing for white audiences, so be it. Dead martyrs couldn't help their people. Living chiefs, even humiliated ones, could still offer guidance and support. The reservation system was designed to destroy traditional culture. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their customs. Kill the Indian, save the man, as the founder of Carlisle Indian School put it. The adults were forced into sedentary agriculture on land poorly suited for farming. The warrior societies were banned. The Sundance was illegal. Everything that made them Lakota was systematically attacked. Some adapted. They learned English. They converted to Christianity. They tried to farm the land the government allotted them. They cut their hair and wore white man's clothes and sent their children to the schools. Survival meant accommodation. Pride didn't feed families. Others resisted in whatever ways remained available. They practiced ceremonies in secret. They taught children the old language when the teachers weren't watching. They maintained spiritual connections to sacred places. The resistance was quieter now, cultural rather than military, but it was resistance nonetheless. The rations were never adequate. The beef the government provided was poor quality. The flour was often spoiled, the blankets were thin, the supplies always arrived late, and the corruption was endemic. Indian agents viewed their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment. Supplies would be sold to white merchants. Rations would be shorted. Complaints would be ignored. Sitting Bull complained repeatedly about conditions on the Standing Rock Reservation, where he'd eventually been settled. The agent, James McLaughlin, viewed Sitting Bull as a troublemaker who undermined government authority. The two men despised each other. McLaughlin saw Sitting Bull as a relic of a savage past that needed to be forgotten. Sitting Bull saw McLaughlin as a petty tyrant enforcing unjust policies. The tension between traditional chiefs and the reservation system was fundamental. The chiefs had led their people for generations, based on earned respect and spiritual authority. Now they were expected to obey government agents who'd been appointed by political connections and had no understanding of or respect for Lakota culture. The humiliation was deliberate. Break the power of the chiefs, and you break the cultural cohesion of the tribes. Red Cloud, who'd won his war and signed the Treaty of 1868, lived to see everything he'd fought for destroyed. The Bozeman Trail was closed, yes, but the Black Hills were taken. The hunting grounds were fenced. The buffalo were extinct. The promised annuities were constantly delayed or reduced. The treaty provisions were violated whenever convenient. Red Cloud lived until 1909, long enough to see his grandchildren grow up speaking English and knowing little of the old ways. The generation of warriors who'd fought at Little Bighorn aged into poverty on reservations. Men who'd counted coup and taken scalps now waited in line for government rations. Warriors who'd once terrified cavalry companies now struggled to feed their families on inadequate allotments of poor land. The transition from freedom to confinement happened within a single generation. One decade they were lords of the plains. The next, they were impoverished wards of a government that viewed them as obstacles to progress. And through it all, the railroad kept running. Trains passing through what had been Lakota territory, carrying settlers to former hunting grounds, bringing supplies to new towns built on land that treaties had promised to the tribes forever. The iron horse that had brought destruction now carried the beneficiaries of that destruction to their new homes. The starving time wasn't just physical, it was spiritual and cultural. The old ways were dying faster than the buffalo had, and unlike the buffalo, which might someday return if protected, the cultural knowledge dying with each elder was irreplaceable. Songs forgotten, stories lost, ceremonies banned and then forgotten when the ban was lifted because no one remembered how to perform them properly. Sitting Bull watched his people diminish, physically from poor rations and disease, spiritually from the loss of connection to sacred practices, culturally from the forced assimilation and the boarding schools. He was maybe 60 years old, though exact birth dates weren't recorded for people born before reservation life. He'd lived through the Golden Age and survived to see its complete destruction, but he hadn't surrendered his identity. He was still Sitting Bull, still a spiritual leader, still someone the people looked to for guidance. And when a new spiritual movement swept through the reservations in 1890, promising the return of the buffalo and the resurrection of dead relatives, Sitting Bull listened. Because what else was there? Hope was dangerous. But without hope, what was the point of survival? The ghost dance was coming, and with it, the final tragedy of the Indian Wars. The prophet's name was Wavoka. He was a Paiute from Nevada who'd had a vision during a solar eclipse in January 1889. In his vision, he visited the spirit world and saw all the dead Indians living happily. They told him to return to Earth and teach the people a sacred dance. If they performed this dance properly, with pure hearts and peaceful intentions, the dead would return to life. The buffalo would come back. The white people would disappear. The world would be renewed, the ghost dance, they called it. A circle dance where participants held hands and moved slowly, singing sacred songs. Some dancers would fall into trances and have visions of dead relatives. The dance wasn't violent. Wavoka preached peace. Don't fight the whites. Don't steal. Don't lie. Live good lives and dance, and the spirits would restore what had been lost. The message spread like prairie fire across the reservations. From the Paiute to the Shoshone to the Arapaho to the Lakota, each tribe adapted the dance to their own traditions. But the core promise remained the same. The dead would return. The buffalo would return. The suffering would end. Think about what that promise meant to people living on reservations in 1889. Everything they'd known was gone. The buffalo were extinct. The old ceremonies were banned. Children were being taken to boarding schools. Starvation was constant. Disease was everywhere. And here comes a prophet saying that if you just dance and believe, it will all be reversed. Not through war, not through politics, through spiritual power. The Lakota embraced the ghost dance with desperate fervor. They added their own elements, sacred shirts painted with symbols that dancers believed would stop bullets. The idea that not just the buffalo but the old way of life would return, that the world would be rolled up like a blanket covering the whites, and underneath would be the plains as they'd been before the settlers came. Short Bull and Kicking Bear, Lakota medicine men, traveled to Nevada to meet Wovoka and learn the dance. They returned with the message and began teaching it to their bands. By fall 1889, ghost dance ceremonies were happening across the Lakota reservations. Hundreds of people dancing in circles, day after day, singing the sacred songs. The reservation agents panicked. They saw thousands of Indians gathering for religious ceremonies they didn't understand. They saw people falling into trances. They saw the sacred shirts and heard rumors that the dancers believed they were invulnerable to bullets. And they saw Sitting Bull, the most famous hostile chief, showing interest in the movement, even if he wasn't actively dancing himself. James McLaughlin, the agent at Standing Rock Reservation, viewed the ghost dance as Sitting Bull's attempt to undermine government authority. He saw it as the beginning of another uprising. He reported to Washington that the situation was becoming dangerous. That military intervention might be necessary. The truth was more complicated. Sitting Bull was interested in the ghost dance because it gave his people hope. He probably didn't believe the dead would literally return or that sacred shirts would stop bullets. But he understood that people needed something to believe in. The old religion had been suppressed. Christianity was the religion of the conquerors. The ghost dance was their own spiritual movement, giving them control over something in their lives. But McLaughlin wanted Sitting Bull arrested, removed from the reservation, neutralized as a potential leader of resistance. In November 1890, he requested permission to arrest Sitting Bull. The army agreed. Buffalo Bill Cody, who'd employed Sitting Bull in his Wild West show, volunteered to go talk to him. Cody thought he could convince Sitting Bull to surrender peacefully, but McLaughlin blocked Cody's involvement. He wanted Indian police to make the arrest, prove that loyal Indians could enforce government authority over hostile chiefs. On December 15, 1890, just before dawn, 43 Indian police officers surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin on the Grand River. They broke down the door and dragged him outside. A crowd of ghost dancers gathered, surrounding the police and their prisoner. The situation was volatile. Sitting Bull resisted. Then someone fired a shot. The fight lasted maybe 15 minutes. When it ended, Sitting Bull was dead, shot in the chest and head. Several police officers were dead. Several ghost dancers were dead. Sitting Bull's 17-year-old son was dead, shot trying to protect his father. The cabin was bullet-riddled, and the most famous Lakota chief of his generation lay dead in the dirt of his own camp, killed by Indian police enforcing white authority. The official story was that Sitting Bull resisted arrest and his followers started the fight. That might be true. Or the police might have killed him deliberately, knowing that bringing him in alive would have been complicated and dangerous. We'll never know exactly what happened in those chaotic minutes, but the result was clear. Sitting Bull was dead at about 60 years old. The man who'd foreseen Custer's death, who'd led the great gathering at Little Bighorn, who'd maintained his dignity through surrender and humiliation. Shot down at a reservation in winter by his own people, acting as agents of the government he'd spent his life resisting. The ghost dancers scattered after Sitting Bull's death. One group, led by Bigfoot, fled south from the Cheyenne River Reservation toward Pine Ridge, hoping to find safety. Bigfoot was maybe 65 years old, a mini-Konju chief trying to protect his people. He had about 350 followers with him, mostly women and children, maybe 100 warriors. Bigfoot himself was sick with pneumonia, coughing blood in the December cold. The army was looking for Bigfoot's band. Cavalry patrols scoured the frozen landscape. On December 28th, the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, intercepted Bigfoot's band. The chief was so sick he was traveling in a wagon. He surrendered immediately, told the officers he was going to Pine Ridge to make peace. The cavalry escorted them to Wounded Knee Creek, about 20 miles from Pine Ridge Agency. That night, both groups camped at Wounded Knee. Bigfoot's band, surrounded by cavalry. The soldiers set up 4 Hotchkiss guns on the hills overlooking the camp. These were small artillery pieces that fired explosive shells. The army claimed they were just taking precautions. But surrounding a camp with artillery doesn't suggest peaceful intentions. December 29th, 1890. The temperature was below freezing. The officers ordered the Lakota to give up their weapons. The people were reluctant. Weapons meant the ability to hunt, to protect yourself. And they didn't trust the army after everything that had happened. But they had no choice. Soldiers searched the camp, tipi by tipi, confiscating rifles and knives. During the search, a medicine man named Yellowbird walked among the dancers, urging them to be strong. He reminded them of the sacred shirts that would stop bullets. He told them not to fear the soldiers. The army officers grew nervous. The tension increased. Then a rifle discharged. Nobody knows for certain who fired it or whether it was accidental or intentional. But the sound of that single shot triggered a massacre. Soldiers opened fire into the crowd of Lakota at point-blank range. Warriors tried to fight back with whatever weapons they could grab. Women and children ran for cover, and the Hotchkiss guns on the hills started firing. Explosive shells tore through the teepees. People running away were cut down by shrapnel and bullets. The fighting was initially concentrated around the council area, but it spread as people fled and soldiers pursued. Some Lakota made it to a ravine where they tried to hide. Soldiers fired down into the ravine, killing anyone who moved. The firing lasted perhaps an hour. When it ended, approximately 300 Lakota were dead or dying. Bigfoot lay frozen in the snow, his body twisted, photographed later for postcards. Mothers died covering their children with their bodies. Babies were found still nursing at their dead mothers' breasts. The sacred shirts, painted with symbols meant to stop bullets, were shredded by real bullets that offered no spiritual protection. Army losses were much lighter. 25 soldiers died, many from friendly fire in the confused close-quarters fighting. The 7th Cavalry would later receive 20 Medals of Honor for Wounded Knee. 20 medals for what was essentially a massacre of refugees. A blizzard moved in that night. The bodies froze in the positions they died. When burial parties arrived days later, they found grotesque scenes. People frozen mid-run, bodies tangled together. The mass grave they dug swallowed nearly 300 people. A photographer took pictures. The soldiers posed with the bodies. The images were sold commercially. Wounded Knee broke the ghost dance movement. The sacred shirts hadn't stopped bullets. The dead hadn't returned. The buffalo hadn't come back. The spiritual promise had been tested with artillery and found wanting. Within weeks, the last ghost dancers surrendered. The religious revival that had promised renewal delivered only more death. But here's where the story shifts from military history to something more complex. Because Wounded Knee wasn't the end. It was a transition. The Indian Wars were over, yes. The last armed resistance was finished. But the Lakota people weren't finished. Charles Eastman was a Santee Sioux doctor who'd been educated at Dartmouth and Boston University School of Medicine. He was at Pine Ridge when the Wounded Knee wounded were brought in. He treated survivors while struggling with his own identity. He was Christian, educated, professional. Everything the assimilation policy was supposed to create. But he was still Lakota. The people dying from Hotchkiss gun wounds were his people. Eastman spent the rest of his life writing and speaking about Indian culture and rights. He was caught between worlds, but he used his education and connections to advocate for his people in ways that warriors with rifles couldn't. The battlefield had moved from Little Bighorn to courtrooms and congressional chambers. The peyote religion spread along the railroad routes that had brought destruction, a spiritual practice that combined native traditions with Christian elements. It offered comfort in a shattered world. The government tried to ban it, but it persisted. Spiritual resistance, when military resistance was no longer possible. Children sent to boarding schools on trains had their hair cut, their clothes replaced, their languages forbidden. Kill the Indian, save the man. But some of those children, like Charles Eastman, learned English and law and came back to fight for their people with legal briefs instead of lances. The weapons changed, but the struggle continued. The Black Hills land claim was filed in 1877, and it's still winding through courts today. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that the taking of the Black Hills was illegal and awarded financial compensation. The Lakota refused the money. The Black Hills aren't for sale, just as Sitting Bull said. The money sits in an account, accumulating interest, unclaimed. Because accepting it would mean acknowledging that the land is gone forever. Today, freight trains thunder past Pine Ridge Reservation, still one of the poorest places in America. The reservation boundaries were drawn to exclude the best land, the valuable resources. The poverty that began with the destruction of the buffalo economy continues in different forms. High unemployment, poor health care, inadequate schools. The systematic destruction never quite ended. It just took new shapes. But the Lakota are still here. That's what matters. Every prediction of their disappearance has been wrong. Every policy designed to assimilate them away has failed. The population is growing. The language, which nearly died, is being revitalized. Young people learn it through smartphone apps, technology that would have seemed as magical to their ancestors as locomotives once did. The sun dance, banned for decades, is practiced openly again. The sacred pipe ceremonies continue. The connection to the Black Hills, to the land, to the ancestors persists. Not unchanged, because cultures that don't change die, but continuous. The sacred hoop bent nearly to breaking, but never shattered. Modern warriors fight in courtrooms over water rights and pipeline routes. They use treaties that were written to dispossess them as weapons to protect what remains. They argue law before judges. They organize protests. They use social media to build networks that span continents. The tactics changed because the battlefield changed. Pine Ridge Reservation today looks nothing like the world of 1876. But it's still Lakota territory. The poverty is real. The problems are immense, but so is the resilience. People maintain identity and culture under circumstances that would have broken weaker communities. The story the American public wanted was simple. Noble savages fighting a losing battle against civilization. Tragic but inevitable. The reality is more complex. People adapting, surviving, maintaining identity across generations of systematic oppression. Losing battles, but refusing to accept final defeat. Sitting Bull's great-grandson might be arguing a treaty case in federal court today. Crazy Horse's descendants might be teaching language classes, or leading ceremony, or fighting to protect sacred sites from resource extraction. The continuity isn't always obvious from outside. But it's there. The Iron Horse brought apocalypse to the plains, but it also carried Lakota children to universities where they study their own history. It brought destruction, but also, eventually, tools for survival. The railroad companies that helped destroy the buffalo economy now run through reservation land, paying lease fees that provide some revenue. The oppressors' tools being used for survival. This isn't a story with a satisfying ending because it isn't over. The boarding schools closed, but the trauma they caused echoes through generations. The buffalo herds were nearly exterminated, but small herds exist now on some reservations, bringing back not just meat, but spiritual connection. The languages nearly died, but revival efforts continue. The massacre at Wounded Knee happened. You can't undo that. Can't bring back the people who died frozen in the snow. Can't erase the trauma of the ghost dancers discovering their sacred shirts couldn't stop bullets. The military conquest was complete and brutal, but conquest isn't the same as elimination. The Lakota didn't disappear into history. They continued into the future. Changed, yes. Traumatized, absolutely. But present. Speaking their language. Teaching their children. Practicing their ceremonies. Maintaining their identity as Lakota people in a world that tried very hard to erase that identity. The final lesson of the Iron Horse in the Plains Wars isn't about military tactics or spiritual visions or broken treaties. It's about resilience, about people who lost everything and kept going, about cultures that were systematically attacked and survived anyway, about communities that maintained identity across generations of oppression. When you hear a train whistle across the plains today, it carries echoes of the destruction it brought. But it also carries Lakota children to school, Lakota families to ceremonies, Lakota activists to protests and court hearings. The iron serpent that pierced the heart of the buffalo herds became just another part of the landscape that Lakota people navigate while remaining Lakota. The wars ended. The people didn't. They're still here. Mitakuye Oyasin. All are related. The sacred phrase encompasses past, present, and future. The ancestors who fought at Little Bighorn. The children learning Lakota today. The yet unborn who will carry the culture forward. All connected. All part of the continuing story. The train whistle blows. The world moves forward. And the Lakota remain, adapting and surviving and maintaining identity in ways their ancestors might not recognize, but would surely honor. Because survival is its own form of victory, and the story continues.